Hello YouTube, Mr. Mellon here again, and today we're going to be looking at features of written standard English today for our English. We're going to be using different types of verb, and the two verbs that we're going to focus on are using appropriate verbs to complete sentences, and we're also going to use irregular past tense verbs. It all sounds rather complicated, but I am going to go through it, and hopefully it will be a lot clearer by the end of the lesson. First of all, we're going to read another few chapters of George's Marvellous Medicine, and then we're going to do some work about the chapters that we've just read using our appropriate verbs. So first of all, I'd like you to sit back, relax and enjoy the next part of the story. So if you can remember, George had made his medicine, Grandma had taken it, and now she's grown to the size of a house, and we're going to find out what's going to happen next. The Brown Hen. George stood in the farmyard looking up at the roof. The old farmhouse had a fine roof of pale red tiles and tall chimneys. There was no sign of Grandma. There was only a song thrush sitting on one of the chimney pots, singing a song. The old Wurzels got stuck in the attic, George thought. Thank goodness for that. Suddenly, a tile came clattering down from the roof and fell into the yard. The thrush took off fast and flew away. Then another tile came down, and then half a dozen more, and then very slowly, like some weird monster rising up from the deep, Grandma's head came through the roof, then her scrawny neck, and the tops of her shoulders.
"How am I doing, boy?" she shouted. "How's that for a bash-up?"
Don't you think you better stop now, Grandma?" George called out.
"I have stopped," she answered. "I feel terrific. Didn't I tell you I had magic powers? Didn't I warn you I had wizardry in the tips of my fingers? But you wouldn't listen to me, would you? You wouldn't listen to your old Grandma."
"You didn't do it, Grandma," George shouted back to her. "I did it. I made you a new medicine."
"A new medicine? You? What rubbish!" she yelled.
I did, George shouted.
"You're lying as usual," Grandma yelled. "You're always lying."
"I'm not lying, Grandma, I swear I'm not." The wrinkled old face high up on the roof stared down suspiciously at George.
"Are you telling me you actually made a new medicine all by yourself?" she shouted.
"Yes, Grandma, all by myself."
"I don't believe you," she answered, "but I'm very comfortable up here. Fetch me a cup of tea."
A brown hen was pecking about in the yard close to where George was standing. The hen gave him an idea. Quickly he uncorked the medicine bottle and poured some of the brown stuff into the spoon. "Watch this, Grandma," he shouted. He crouched down, holding out the spoon to the hen. "Chicken," he said. Chicken, come here, have some of this." Chickens are stupid birds and very greedy. They think everything is food. This one thought the spoon was full of corn. It hopped over, it put its head on one side and looked at the spoon. "Come on, chicken," George said. "Good chicken. Chick, chick, chick." The brown hen stretched out its neck toward the spoon and went peck. It got a beak full of medicine. The effect was electric. "Whee!" shrieked the hen, and it shot straight up into the air like a rocket. It went as high as the house. Then down it came again into the yard, splosh, and there it sat with its feathers all sticking straight out from its body. There was a look of amazement on its silly face. George stood watching it. Grandma up on the roof was watching it too. The hen got to its feet. It was rather shaky. It was making funny gurgling noises in its throat. Its beak was opening and shutting. It seemed like a pretty sick hen.
"You've done it in, you stupid boy," Grandma shouted. "The hen's going to die. Your father will be after you now. He'll give you socks and serve you right."
All of a sudden, black smoke started pouring out of the hen's beak.
"It's on fire," Grandma yelled. "The hen's on fire."
George ran to the water trough to get a bucket of water.
"That hen will be roasted and ready for eating any moment," Grandma shouted.
George sloshed the bucket of water over the hen. There was a sizzling sound and the smoke went away.
"Old hen's laid its last egg," Grandma shouted. "Hens don't do any laying after they've been on fire."
Now that the fire was out, the hen seemed better. It stood up properly, it flapped its wings, and it crouched down low to the ground as though getting ready to jump. It did jump. It jumped high in the air and turned a complete somersault, then landed back on its feet.
"It's a circus hen," Grandma shouted from the rooftop. "It's a flipping acrobat."
Now the hen began to grow. George had been waiting for this to happen. "It's growing," he yelled. "It's growing, Grandma. Look, it's growing." Bigger and bigger, taller and taller, it grew. Soon the hen was 4 or 5 times its normal size. "Can you see it, Grandma?" George shouted.
"I can see it, boy," the old woman shouted back. "I'm watching it."
George was hopping about from one foot to the other with excitement, pointing at the enormous hen and shouting, "It's had the magic medicine, Grandma, and it's growing just like you did." But there was a difference between the way the hen was growing and the way Grandma grew. When Grandma grew taller and taller, she got thinner and thinner. The hen didn't. It stayed nice and plump all along. Soon it was taller than George, but it didn't stop there. It went right on growing until it was about as big as a horse. Then it stopped. "Doesn't it look marvellous, Grandma?" George shouted.
"It's not as tall as me," Grandma sang out. "Compared with me, that hen is ditchy small. I am the tallest of them all."
At that moment, George's mother came back from shopping in the village. She drove her car into the yard and got out. She was carrying a bottle of milk in one hand and a bag of groceries in the other. The first thing she saw was the gigantic brown hen towering over little George. She dropped the bottle of milk. Then Grandma started shouting at her from the rooftop, and when she looked up and saw Grandma's head sticking up through the tiles, she dropped the bag of groceries.
"How about that then, eh, Mary?" Grandma shouted. "I bet you'll never see a hen as big as that. That's George's giant hen, that is."
But, stammered George's mother.
"It's George's magic medicine," Grandma shouted. "We both of us had it, the hen and I."
But how in the world did you get up on the roof?" cried the mother.
"I didn't," cackled the old woman. "My feet are still standing on the floor in the living room."
This was too much for George's mother to understand. She just goggled and gaped. She looked as though she was going to faint. A second later, George's father appeared. His name was Mr. Cranky, and Mr. Cranky was a small man with bandy legs and a huge head. He was a kind father to George, but he was not an easy person to live with, because even the smallest things got him all worked up and excited. The hen standing in the yard was certainly not a small thing, and when Mr. Cranky saw it, he started jumping about as though something was burning his feet. "Oh, great heavens!" he cried, waving his arms. "What's this? What's happened? Where did it come from? It's a giant hen. Who did it?"
"I did," George said. "Look at me," Grandma shouted from the rooftop. "Never mind about the hen. What about me?"
Mr. Cranky looked up and saw Grandma. "Oh, shut up, Grandma," he said. It didn't seem to surprise him that the old girl was sticking up through the roof. It was the hen that excited him. He had never seen anything like it. But then who had? "It's fantastic," Mr. Cranky shouted, dancing around and around. "It's colossal. It's gigantic. It's tremendous. It's a miracle. How did you do it, George?" George started telling his father about the magic medicine. While he was doing this, the big brown hen sat down in the middle of the yard and went quack, 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 quack. Everyone stared at it. When it stood up again, there was a brown egg lying there. The egg was the size of a football. "That egg would make scrambled eggs for 20 people, Mrs. Cranky said. "George," Mr. Cranky shouted, "how much of this medicine have you got?" "Lots," George said. "There's a big pot full in the kitchen, and this bottle here is nearly full." "Come with me," Mr. Cranky yelled, grabbing George by the arm. "Bring that medicine. For years and years I've been trying to breed bigger and bigger animals. Bigger bulls for beef, bigger pigs for pork, bigger sheep for mutton." They went to the pigsty first. George gave a spoonful of medicine to the pig, and the pig blew smoke from its nose and jumped about all over the place as it grew. They went to the herd of fine black bullocks that Mr. Cranky was trying to fatten for the market. George gave each of them some of the medicine, and they started to grow. Then the sheep, He gave some to his grey pony, Jack Frost. And finally, just for fun, he gave some to Alma, the goat. So there we go. That was the next part of George's Marvellous Medicine. What we're going to do now is we're going to have a go at task 1 on our sheet. And we're going to have a go at using the verbs was, were, is, or am to fill in the gaps. So we need to think about when we use was, were, am, and is. We use was when we're writing in the past tense, when something's happened a while ago. And we usually use it when we're talking about what's happened with one person, or one object, or one place. So you might see in the first sentence it says the hen was laying an egg. How many hens are we talking about in a sentence? Well, it says hen, so that must mean there's only one hen. There's one of them. If we're writing about one hen in the past tense, we would use the verb was. But if we're talking about more than one hen, which would be a plural, then we would use the verb were. So we use was when we're describing or explaining something about one person or one object, but we use were when there's more than one person or more than one object. And that we use was and were for the past tense, when things have happened a while ago, not right now. So we have words in the past tense, but we also have verbs in the present tense. So the past tense, like I said, is something that's happened a while ago. It's not happening right now, but the present tense means it's happening in the present. It's happening right now. Now the next sentence says, I am mixing the medicine. It's the present tense. It's happening now. And we're just talking about ourselves. We're using the first person. We're talking about ourselves. Now, if we're using the first person and we're writing in the present tense, we use the verb am. But if we're using the third person where we're writing about somebody else, we use the verb is. George is mixing the medicine. So was and were are verbs that we use in the past tense, one for one person, one for more than one. And am and is we use for the present tense, things that are happening right now. Let's see if we can use them in sentences now. For birds, something flying away when Grandma crashed through the roof. The birds was flying away when Grandma crashed through the roof. The birds were flying away when Grandma crashed through the roof. The birds is flying away when Grandma crashed through the roof. Or the birds am flying away from when Grandma crashed through the roof. Which one do you think? I think were, because it happened in the past tense and it's more than one bird. It's a plural, so I'm going to use the verb were. Let's try for the next one. I was not lying, said George. I were not lying, said George. I is not lying, said George. Or I am not lying, said George. What do you think? I think am, because for George, this is happening in the present. It's happening right now. I am not lying, said George. A hen was in the farmyard and drank the medicine. A hen were in the farmyard and drank the medicine. A hen is in the farmyard and drank the medicine. Or a hen am in the farmyard and drank the medicine. Well, drank is a past tense verb, so it must have happened in the past tense. So it could be was or were. We're talking about one hen. There's only one hen, so it must be was, because it's talking about one animal and it's in the past tense. Now you guys can have a go at filling in your sheets with the rest of the sentences and see if you can use the correct verbs to fill in the gaps. Once you've done that, carry on with the video. So pause now, have a go at the sheet, and then hit play once you're ready. Okay, so hopefully by now you'll have finished that task 1 on your sheet, so we'll be moving on to task 2. Before we do task 2, we're going to read a bit more of the story, and then we'll come back to task 2 later. So just pop your sheet and your pen or pencil down, or if you're on the computer, just pause for now and sit back and relax, and we'll read a bit more of the story. Grandma from high up on the rooftop could see everything that was going on. And she didn't like what she saw. She wanted to be the centre of attention, and nobody was taking the slightest notice of her. George and Mr. Cranky were running around and getting excited about the enormous animals. Mrs. Cranky was washing up in the kitchen, and Grandma was all alone on the rooftop.
Hey, you, she yelled. Judge, get me a cup of tea this minute, you idle little beast.
Oh, don't listen to the old goat, Mr. Cranky said. She's stuck where she is, and a good thing too. But we can't leave her up there, Dad, George said. What if it rains?
Judge, Grandma yelled. Oh, you horrible little boy, you disgusting little worm. Fetch me a cup of tea at once and a slice of currant cake.
We'll have to get her out, Dad, George said. She won't give us any peace if we don't. Mrs. Cranky came outside and she agreed with George. She's my own mother, she said. She's a pain in the neck, Mr. Cranky said. I don't care, Mrs. Cranky said. I'm not leaving my own mother sticking up through the roof for the rest of her life. So in the end, Mr. Cranky telephoned the crane company and asked them to send their biggest crane out to the house at once. The crane arrived 1 hour later. It was on wheels and there were 2 men inside it. The crane men climbed up onto the roof and put ropes under Grandma's arms. Then she was lifted right up through the roof. In a way, the medicine had done Grandma good. It hadn't made her any less grumpy or bad-tempered. But it seemed to have cured her all of her aches and pains, and she was suddenly as frisky as a ferret. As soon as the crane had lowered her to the ground, she ran over to George's huge pony, Jack Frost, and jumped onto his back. This ancient old hag, who was now as tall as a house, then galloped about the farm on the gigantic pony, jumping over trees and sheds and shouting,
Out of my way, clear the decks, stand back all you miserable midgets, or I'll trample you to death,
and other silly things like that. But because Grandma was now much too tall to get back into the house, she had to sleep that night in the hay barn with the mice and the rats. The next day, George's father came down to breakfast in a state of greater excitement than ever. I've been awake all night thinking about it, he cried. About what, Dad? George asked him. About your marvellous medicine, of course. We can't stop now, my boy. We must start making more of it at once. More and more and more. The giant stewing pots had been completely emptied the day before because there had been so many sheep and pigs and cows to be dosed. But why do we need more, Dad? George asked. We've done all of our own animals, and we've made Grandma feel as frisky as a ferret, even though she does have to sleep in the barn. My dear boy, cried Mr. Killy Cranky, we need barrels and barrels of it, tons and tons. Then we'll sell it to every farmer in the world so that all of them can have giant animals. We'll build a marvellous medicine factory, and we'll sell the stuff in bottles at $10 each. We'll become rich, and you'll become famous. But wait a minute, Dad, George said. There's no waiting, cried Mr. Cranky, working himself up so much that he put butter in his coffee and milk on his toast. Don't you understand what this tremendous invention of yours is going to do to the world? Nobody will ever go hungry again. Why won't they? Asked George. Because one giant cow will give 50 buckets of milk a day, cried Mr. Cranky, waving his arms. One giant chicken will make 100 fried chicken dinners, and one giant pig will give you 1,000 pork chops. It's tremendous, my dear boy. It's fantastic. It'll change the world. But wait a minute, Dad, George said again. Don't keep saying wait a minute, shouted Mr. Cranky. There isn't a minute to wait. We must get cracking at once. Do calm down, my dear, Mrs. Cranky said from the other end of the table, and stop putting marmalade on your cornflakes. The heck with my cornflakes, cried Mr. Cranky, leaping up from his chair. Come on, George, let's get going, and the first thing we'll do is to make one more stew potful as a tester. But, Dad, said little George, the trouble is, there won't be any trouble, my boy, cried Mr. Cranky. How can there possibly be any trouble? All you've got to do is put the same stuff into the pot as you did yesterday, and while you're doing it, I'll write down each and every item. That's how we'll get the magic recipe. But, Dad, George said, please, listen to me. Why don't you listen to him, Mrs. Cranky said. The boy's trying to tell you something. But Mr. Cranky was too excited to listen to anyone except himself. And then, he cried, when the new mixture is ready, we'll test it out on an old hen just to make sure we got it right. And after that, we'll all shout hooray and build the giant factory. But, Dad, come on then, what is it you want to say? I can't possibly remember all the hundreds of things I put into the pot to make the medicine, George said. Of Course you can, my dear boy, cried Mr. Cranky. I'll help you. I'll jog your memory. You'll get it in the end. You see if you don't. Now then, what was the very first thing you put in? I went up to the bathroom first, George said. I used a lot of things in the bathroom and on Mummy's dressing table. Come on then, cried Mr. Cranky. Up we go to the bathroom. When they got there, they found, of course, a whole lot of empty tubes and empty aerosol cans and empty bottles. That's great, said Mr. Cranky. That tells us exactly what you used. If anything is empty, it means you used it. So Mr. Cranky started making a list of everything that was empty in the bathroom. Then they went to Mrs. Cranky's dressing table. A box of powder, said Mr. Cranky, writing it down. Helga's hair set, flowers of turnips perfume. Terrific. This is going to be easy. Where did you go next? To the laundry room, George said. But are you sure you haven't missed anything up here, Dad? That's up to you, my boy, Mr. Cranky said. Have I? I don't think so, George said. So down they went to the laundry room, and once again Mr. Cranky wrote down the names of all the empty bottles and cans. What a mass of stuff you used, he cried. No wonder it did magic things. Is that a lot? No, Dad, it's not, George said, and he led his father out to the shed where the animal medicines were kept and showed him the 5 empty bottles up on the shelf. Mr. Cranky wrote down all of their names. Anything else? Mr. Cranky asked. Little George scratched his head and thought, but he couldn't remember having put anything else in. Mr. Killy Cranky leapt into his car and drove down to the village and bought new bottles and tubes and cans of everything on his list. He then went to the vet and got a fresh supply of all the animal medicines George had used. Now show me how you did it, George, he said. Show me exactly how you mixed it all together. They were in the kitchen now and the big stewing pot was on the stove. All the things Mr. Cranky had bought were lined up near the sink. Come along, my boy, cried Mr. Killy Cranky. Which one did you put in first? This one, George said. Golden Gloss hair shampoo. He emptied the bottle into the pot. Now the toothpaste, George went on, and the shaving soap, and the face cream, and the nail polish. Keep at it, my boy, cried Mr. Cranky, dancing around the kitchen. Keep putting them in. Don't stop. Don't pause. Don't hesitate. It's a pleasure, my dear fellow, to watch you work. One by one, George poured and squeezed the things into the stewing pot. With everything so close at hand, the whole job didn't take him more than 10 minutes. But when it was all done, the pot didn't somehow seem to be quite as full as it had been the first time. "Oh, what did you do?" cried Mr. Cranky. "Did you stir it?" "I boiled it," George said, "but not for long, and I stirred it as well." So Mr. Cranky lit the gas under the pot, and George stirred the mixture with the same long wooden spoon he'd used before. "It's not brown enough," George said. "Oh, wait a minute, I know what I've forgotten." "What?" cried Mr. Cranky. "Tell me quick, because if we've forgotten even one tiny thing, then it won't work, at least not in the same way." "A quart of brown gloss paint," George said. "That's what I've forgotten." Mr. Killy Cranky shot out of the house and into his car like a rocket. He sped down to the village and bought the paint and rushed back again. He opened the can in the kitchen and handed it to George. George poured the paint into the stewing pot. "Aha, that's better," George said. "That's more like the right colour." "It's boiling," cried Mr. Cranky. "It's boiling and bubbling. George, is it ready yet?" "It's ready," George said. "At least I hope it is." "Right," shouted Mr. Cranky, hopping about. "Let's test it. Let's give some to a chicken." "My heavens alive, why don't you calm down a bit?" Mrs. Cranky said, coming into the kitchen. "Calm down?" cried Mr. Cranky. "You expect me to calm down, and here we are mixing up the greatest medicine ever discovered in the history of the world? Come along, George, dip a cupful out of the pot and get a spoon and we'll give some to a chicken, just to make absolutely certain we got the correct mixture." Outside in the yard there were several chickens that hadn't had any of George's marvellous medicine number 1. They were pecking about in the dirt, in that silly way that chickens do. George crouched down, holding out a spoonful of marvellous medicine number 2. "Come on, chickens," he said. "Good chicken. Chick, chick, chick." A white chicken with black specks on its feathers looked up at George. It walked over to the spoon and went peck. The effect that medicine number 2 had on this chicken was not quite the same as the effect produced by medicine number 1, but it was very interesting. Whoosh, shrieked the chicken, and it shot 6 feet up in the air and came down again. Then sparks came flying out of its beak, bright yellow sparks of fire, as though someone was sharpening a knife on a grindstone inside its tummy. Then its legs began to grow longer. Its body stayed the same size, but the two thin yellow legs got longer and longer and longer and longer still. What's happening to it? Cried Mr. Kiddie Cranky. Something's wrong, George said. The legs went on growing, and the more they grew, the higher up into the air went the chicken's body. When the legs were about 15 feet long, they stopped growing. The chicken looked perfectly absurd with its long, long legs and its ordinary little body perched high up on top. It was like a chicken on stilts. Oh, my sainted aunts, cried Mr. Kiddie Cranky. We got it wrong. This chicken's no good to anybody. It's all legs. No one wants chicken legs. I must have left something out, George said. I know you left something out, cried Mr. Cranky. Think, boy, think. What was it you left out? I've got it, said George. What was it? Quick. Flea powder for dogs, George said. You mean you put flea powder in the first one? Yes, Dad, I did, a whole carton of it. And that's the answer. Wait a minute, said George. Did we have brown shoe polish on our list? We did not, said Mr. Cranky. I used that too, said George. Well, no wonder it went wrong, said Mr. Cranky. He was already running to his car, and soon he was heading down to the village to buy more flea powder and more shoe polish. I guess we're going to leave it there, and then we're going to have a look at task 2 on our sheet. Irregular past tense. So a past tense means when we write about things that have happened in the past. So not happening right now, they happened before. Now we can get regular past tense verbs, which we actually know really well. So here's my verb, walk. And to change it into the past tense, I'm just going to add a suffix. I'm just going to add some letters at the end. ed to make the verb walked. So we've changed it from present tense, happening now, to past tense, happening in the past. Same for start. This is a regular past tense verb. So I was going to add ed at the end to turn it into started. So regular past tense verbs where we add ed at the end. Really quite simple. But it gets a bit trickier when we get to the irregular past tense verbs because they don't follow the ed rule. They follow different rules. Let's think of an example. Let me have a think. For example, let's take the verb stride. So stride means to walk with really big paces. Stride. Now, if this was a regular past tense verb, it would become strided. But that doesn't make sense. Instead, we would say strode. So it doesn't have an ed at the end. We don't add a suffix. So this is an irregular past tense verb because it doesn't follow the ed rule. Could also say the same for write. What would the past tense word of write? Would it be righted? No, it doesn't follow the same rule. It's an irregular past tense verb, so we'll put wrote. So what we'll do is we'll have a look at the first 3 questions together, and then you guys can have a go at doing the rest of the questions by yourself. Let's just quickly rub these out. Okay, first sentence says, a crane taked Grandma out the house. Would it be taked? A crane took Grandma out the house, or a crane tooked Grandma out the house? Which one sounds right, do you think? I think it would be a crane took Grandma out the house. Let's look at the second one. Grandma rided a horse, Grandma roded a horse, or Grandma rode a horse. Which one do you think? I don't think it's rided. I don't think it's roded. I think the right past tense verb would be rode, because it's an irregular past tense verb. Grandma rode a horse. That sounds more like it. That sounds like it makes sense. So let me highlight that verb. Okay, and then the last one. George's dad beginned his plans to make the medicine. George's dad began his plans to make the medicine. Or George's dad begun to make his plans, or had begun his plans to make the medicine. Which one do you think sounds right? I think began. George's dad began his plans to make the medicine. So there we go. Now you guys can have a go at doing the rest of them by yourself. Can't wait to see how you get on with those. So remember, those irregular past tense verbs, they don't follow the ED rule. They follow a different rule. So give that a go. I can't wait to see what you get up to. Talk to you soon. Bye for now.